This is a recording of the talk that I gave at AtlasCamp in Barcelona in 2017. It's easy to write a dumb chatbot. It's much harder to write a chatbot that appears to be quite smart. And in this talk I'm going to give you some techniques for how you can write a chatbot that looks quite smart and gets smarter over time, that is very accessible to almost any kind of programmer. It doesn't require any major artificial intelligence language skills or anything particularly sophisticated. There are three kinds of chatbots. There are command chatbots. So often in a HipChat environment, programmers will set up a slash command to perform some action. So perhaps a slash rebuild that goes and fetches the sources out of Git, compiles it up, makes a set of artifacts and deploys them to Amazon, and then maybe records a message into Jira to say that a particular bug has been fixed or deployed. Now, these are almost always cost effective to develop because anything that you do that saves programmers time almost always wins out. The second kind is a little bit harder, and that's the task-based kinds of chatbots. And these are where the chatbot controls the conversation and just has to reach some objective. These are particularly popular in China because of the ecosystem around chat there. In fact, where in the West we'd probably just use a web-based form that you filled in, it's common in the Chinese market to have a task-based conversational chat. Now, if the chatbot gets to control the conversation, so it's ordering a pizza, for example, it asks questions like, what do you want on the pizza? How do you want it sliced? When do you want it? And the user really doesn't have a lot of choices as to what they can say. They are forced down a particular conversational path. These aren't too hard to write, and in fact you'll see there's quite a lot of libraries that support doing that kind of development. The hardest is the conversational kind of chatbots, where the user chooses what they're going to do, and the chatbot just has to respond in some intelligent way. This is the goal of quite a number of organisations I've worked with. They would love to automate large amounts of their help desk or their support desk, because this is an expensive drain on resources in most IT organisations, and customer support can be some of the most expensive parts of running a business. And I see three problems occur time and time again. The first is the belief that we could make a wonderful substitute for a trained support desk personnel by querying Confluence, and that Confluence has all the answers in it, and that if we could just formulate the question in a way that we can use Confluence search, that we would be able to get an answer out of it. I've seen variations on this, which is where it's not just search Confluence, but it's search the whole intranet, or sometimes let's search the internet, including internet forums, to try and find the perfect answer to the question. Now, there's a couple of things that go wrong with that. The first is that in most organisations, the knowledge base internally only gets updated when a problem has been occurring lots and lots of times. And the more significant problem, though, is that quite often you don't actually have the answer to the question because the user themselves can't necessarily articulate what the issue is. It's like when you go to the doctor. You don't expect to be able to tell the doctor what's wrong. You go to the doctor so the doctor can ask you questions that can elucidate what it is what the problem is. So in the same way, in many support desks, the problem is not actually let's find the answer to the user's problem, but let's find a really intelligent and useful question that we can ask the user that might explain the problem a bit further. The second problem that I see in a lot of organisations that are trying to automate their support and help desk arrangements is that they try too hard. They try to answer every question. And you can't do this. There's always going to be some odd situation that the chatbot was never programmed for. So you always need to have human beings in the loop in some way. The more you try to automate, the more expensive it gets, and you spend a lot of time programming up corner cases that are so rare that they may never actually get used. Lastly, the really sad case that I see is a number of organisations that really didn't have confidence in their programmers. There was this belief that all the artificial intelligence stuff is going to come out of Facebook or Google or IBM Watson or Amazon Lex, and that all we need to do is develop a personality and some knowledge, and we'll let all the artificial intelligence stuff be done by one of the big vendors. And it doesn't work very well. Let me give you an example. I'll just go through running a chatbot development using Google's API.ai. So the way it works is that you create an intent for each different kind of thing that a user might want to do. So let's imagine that we're in a large organization and a user keeps asking things like, how do I complete my TPS report? So then we need to come up with some suitable answer to this particular question. How about don't do it, no one reads it anyway? Seems a useful kind of response. We'll save that off and create another intent. So let's have our next intent, which would be how about how we do a password change? So how do I change my password? And we'll have a kind of silly response here that we do all our password management by facial recognition, so the only way to change your password is if you have some plastic surgery. Right, so I've got two intents now, one for the TPS report and one for password. So now I can test that out and see what would happen if a user asked the question, how do I complete my TPS report? And the answer is, of course, don't do it, no one reads it anyway. That's the response. Then we could do the same thing with how do I change my password, and we should get some sort of response back. Yep, that's all working correctly. Now let's ask something a little bit more ambiguous. What is a TPS report? And of course we get a response back that's terribly enthusiastic but completely incorrect. How do I? Again, it's vague, but we get an answer back when we probably shouldn't. It's only when we ask something incredibly vague like how that we hit this default fallback intent. And that default fallback intent is, in most environments, going to get hit somewhere between 10 and 50% of the time. We don't understand what the chat is about. Now that's just the beginning of the problem. One of the other issues is that quite often you'll have a long conversational back and forth with the user to try and get to where you need to, and the answer that you're supposed to give at some point in the conversation probably depends on what the user had said far back in history. It could be 2 or 3 messages earlier is the name of the system that they're trying to work with, and that you depend on that. The other problem is the out of order problem. Let's say the question is, how do I change my password? Then you'll ask, well, which system? And you'll say for Confluence, and then you give an answer. But that could come in 1 or 2 different orders. It could be, how do I change my password? Confluence. Or it could be that I've got a problem with Confluence. Okay, what's the problem? The problem is that I need to change my password. So you've got 2 different orderings in which that particular conversation could flow. Or it could even be that the user asks, how do I change my password in Confluence? So it gives you a 3rd order of information being supplied to you in order to provide an answer. And if you try to manually program through each of these, you find that it blows out exponentially. If there's 4 questions to ask, there are at least 24 different conversational flows. It's tedious, it's very buggy, and it's very, very hard to test as well because of the number of different variations. So it would be nice if there were a better technique for having conversational support chatbots. Well, there is, and it's called supervised machine learning. Machine learning is where you give the computer some data and then you get the computer to generate some rules as to how to reproduce that same information. So here on the left I've got some blue dots and some red dots, and I'd like the computer to generate some sort of rule mechanism as to how to classify dots as to whether they should be marked as blue or red. So roughly speaking, stuff on the left should be bluish, stuff on the right should be reddish, depending on how far left and how far up or down. And in fact, predicting what you say next is a machine learning problem. There are some contexts where we talk and we ask exactly the same kind of questions. So one of the examples that Luke, the track lead, observed was that on a first date, people ask exactly the same questions. Where are you from? What do you do? And so it's very easy to predict that sort of stuff. In fact, it's very easy to predict that kind of thing in a support room as well, because you'll always have a user who's asking the same dumb questions time and time again. Or in a large support environment, you may have so many users that you keep hitting the same question just by chance, just because of the number of people being involved. So, given a chat room, one of the big challenges is disentangling the conversation. So, just looking through this particular chat thread, I asked a question, and then Michael asked a question, and then support got back to me with an answer. I replied back to support, then support replied back to Michael Jones, and then Michael Jones replied back to support. So it's not as simple as it would be convenient. In order to predict what needs to be said next, we need to disentangle the conversation so it turns into user, agent, that kind of backwards and forwards. So we can do two techniques. The first one is we'll observe that there was an at mention here to Michael Jones. So clearly this answer must be replying back to Michael Jones's question earlier. And with that, that's actually, in this case, enough to disentangle the entire conversation. But we've also got another trick we can use, which is the quick response. If we have, in my case, I've replied back to support very quickly with a response that's very much along the lines of thanks or bye or another one of these sort of positive ending messages. So clearly I was replying back to support, so therefore support must have been replying back to me. And so with that, I can now disentangle this as two separate conversations. One which is where I ask a question and then support answers and then I say thanks, and then the other one which is where Michael asks a question, support answers, and then Michael gives a response. Now, having disentangled it, I now need to turn this into a set of numbers so that I can use some sort of machine learning techniques on this. So the way the bag of words model works is it says that it probably doesn't matter in which order words appear in a message. It's probably just particular words are going to be significant. Now, the bag of words model is not necessarily the best technique, but it is one that's very simple to program. So we take every word in the English language and we assign it a position in a large array. So if your message mentions the word aardvark, we'll put a 1 in the first column of this very large array. If you mention aardwolf, then we'll put it into we'll put a 1 in the second column. And so on through up to the word zygote, which I believe is probably the last word in the English language. So in this case, because I had how do I complete my TPS report, there will be 7 ones in this array. This array was about 70,000 elements wide, so it's a very sparse array, almost all zeros, with just a 1 in the column for complete, a 1 in the column for do, a 1 in the column for I, and a 1 in the column for TPS. Then, because I need to depend on things that people have said in the past, I need to have a kind of memory vector as well. So the way I've implemented, which is really, really quick and easy, is just exponentially decay. What that means is, after you've said something, we've got an array, perhaps 1001,000, like I've got on the bottom left-hand side of the screen there. When you say something after that, we just pick up that vector, the 1001,000, and add it on to half of whatever was sitting in the memory vector. The memory vector gets initialized with a whole bunch of zeros, and just as you say things, it will get numbers put into it. So as you can see in the memory vector on the top left-hand corner there, 0.25, 0.5, 0.01, whatever it is that's in column 0 there, maybe aardvark, if that's how I've ordered things, clearly must have been said about 2 or 3 steps ago in the conversation. So it's sitting at 0.25. A moment ago it would have been 0.5, before that it would have been 1.0, and before that it would have been sitting in the what the user last said vector. And we also do that with the agent as well, because sometimes, like a yes-no question, you don't know what the user was meaning unless you have the context of what the agent asked. So putting it together, that was a very wide vector, and then we want to have a number of rows in this array so that we can train it. I tend to use a bot training room so that it's got all the information there in a clean manner, with the same answers being given by support each time. And also it works around a problem that some of you might remember Microsoft Tay last year. Microsoft made the mistake of letting their chatbot learn from untrusted sources. And it gave this idea of semi-autonomous chatbots that learn a bit of a bad reputation. So when I'm dealing with customers that bring up Microsoft Tay as an objection to this kind of technique, I usually say, well, we'll have a bot training room where only authorized people are allowed to put in messages, and we'll train from that. So the chat training room that I'm going to use in this example is this one, where we have questions like, I need to change my password for which system, answer Confluence, and then an answer's given, and then a question about TPS reports as well. So let's put that together, and I'll just show you some code. Up the top here I've got, I'm just importing a simple library that can read from a HipChat export. I need to supply a few little bits of information, like the zip file where I exported it from, and the name of a training room. Read that in and call that a corpus, so the body of different dialogues. What it does is extracting out and saying whoever the user was support, that's going to be the agent, everybody else gets to be the user. So that means we have a corpus that looks like this. A user asks the question, how do I change my password? The agent replies back for which system. The user says Confluence. The agent says something in response. Then we have a couple of other dialogues that the system has been trained on. So the known things that agents answer for which system, and a choose your profile, that's like the password reset instructions for Confluence, and then a don't bother, nobody reads it anyway. And then we have a known responses that users have given. So then I have this library called Brain, which is just a wrapper around creating that bag of words model, and then a logistic regression model to do the prediction. And just looking at the data that it produces, it says, if the word password appears in that vector of what the user has last said, that's one row there, the answer is for which system, and then there's another row where the answer is for which system that was also associated with the password. You'll also see that the user's memory, as in something that in the previously has mentioned password, there's a common response there, which is to give the instructions about resetting a password in Confluence. And the word TPS is a good predictor of don't bother anyway. And we can even show the strengths of other words as well. So here's Confluence, and if the user has just mentioned the word Confluence, then it's a good good predictor that we should give the password reset instructions. So let's just do an example of that. So here I am in a HIP chat room, so a support help desk room. I'm going to type in a question, what should I do with my TPS report? I've never done it before. Note that that's not exactly a phrasing that we saw in the bot training room. Anyway, let's just see what happens. So the code in the first cell is just as it was in the previous slide. Looking now, I'm going to poll for messages just to see what new messages have appeared in the room. And ignore messages from support because I'm only interested in picking up on users. Let's run that. Then I can ask what was the most recent dialogue, so the backwards and forwards between user and the agent. So it's just a user saying, what should I do with the TPS report? That's what I just typed in. Then what we do is we want to get the possible predicted outcomes and their probabilities. So I run the code here, and there are a couple of different things that the support agent might say. With a probability of 35%, a support agent is likely to respond, don't bother, nobody reads it anyway, which is of course the correct answer in this case. With a slightly lower probability, the answer would be for which system, and with an even lower probability, the answer would be to give the password reset instructions for Confluence. Now we can also explain how it reached those conclusions because I'm using a fairly simple machine learning model. And basically it's looking for individual words and giving them a weight. So the word report is a really strong predictor that the correct thing to say is don't bother, nobody reads it anyway. The word TPS is also a very good predictor, but the word my, on the other hand, is a very good negative predictor. We don't see that much in referring to TPS reports. So overall it got 0.07 points. For which system, on the other hand, the word my is a reasonably good predictor. However, report and TPS are really contra-indicative. They really suggest that this is not likely to be the case. And finally, giving the password reset instructions to a question about TPS reports, it's clearly wrong. You don't see the word report or TPS. So therefore, the conclusion is the best answer to give is don't bother, nobody reads it anyway, which is kind of appropriate. So let's put all this together into one library. So that's the code from the first screen a moment ago. Then from the previous code demo I just did a moment ago. Now let's actually see code as it would be in production. So we'd sit in an infinite loop getting new messages from the room. And whenever there's a new message, we construct the dialogue. So that's the who said, from the user to the agent, and the user and agent back again. And if we're waiting for a response from the user, then there's no point in us doing anything. So we pull out the predictions based on the most recent dialogue that's happened, and the first in that prediction list is going to be the highest probability. I wrote the code that way, and we've got a very low threshold. If we're 25% confident that it's the right answer, then we will pull the text out of the prediction, send a message, and print a debugging message into this display here. Otherwise, if we're not sure about it, then we'll just print a message saying we couldn't be sure about this particular prediction. So, seeing it in action, user types in, I'd like to reset my password, but I don't know how. Within about 5 seconds, the system goes and looks up, and the most probable answer to that is for which system. Moving on, I say the word confluence, and then the chatbot can very confidently give the answer of the confluence password reset instructions. So just looking back at the code, as you can see, it printed out the messages that it was responding to with a for which system, and that was 39% likely that that's what a human being would respond in that context. And then we have a much higher probability, 43%, of the next step being the choose your profile picture from the top right hand corner, the confluence reset instructions. So just a reminder of what we have done. Just by typing messages into a bot training room with no additional programming needed, we can train a chatbot that can give useful and sensible responses in place of a human being. You don't need to hire programmers to write complicated scenarios. You don't need to use some third-party library like API.ai to get a very basic and simple chatbot set up. All you really need is an intern to go and type in some messages into a bot training room. And if you want to, you can also train a bot from answers given by support desk agents in a real help desk room. There's a few issues there. It's difficult to get clean answers and consistent answers, but there are some techniques that you can use to work around that as well. Now, if you're familiar with natural language processing or data science, you probably have been spending most of the talk having a bit of a giggle about how naive the techniques are. So, for example, where I used a bag of words, it's probably more common to use TF-IDF or BM25. Just look them up in Wikipedia. They're just a slightly better algorithm for handling these kinds of phrases. Or the big news from the last couple of years has been that word2vec is a better approach. Instead of having these 70,000 element wide arrays, you can embed that into a lower dimensional space. So you might end up with only 300 dimensions wide, which means it's much easier to get accurate predictions out. And instead of that model of having what the users last said and an exponentially decaying memory, the other common technique is to use an LTSM architecture, long-term, short-term memory, within a neural network, and then of course it can just be fed a sequence of dialogue steps, probably from a compressed word2vec model, and you'll get quite good results quite quickly from that. However, these are slightly more sophisticated programming techniques, and they're a little bit harder to be able to diagnose and debug. Well, it's traditional to end every IT talk with "and one last thing." What else is it that we're able to predict from chat conversations? We were able to predict what the next sentence is likely to be, but what else can we do? Well, I'm here to say that we had some very interesting results from some analysis I did earlier this year, where I was looking at where we have conversations in a chat room about a project. There was some clear distinctions between the kinds of things that were being said in projects that were running into trouble versus projects that were running within budget. So we could also look at not just the vocabulary, but the timing and the number of messages and so on. And we found that we were actually able to do some quite good predictions about which projects are likely to run into trouble in the future. So I think putting it all together, the fact that with some very simple techniques we can have everything from support work to help desk work through to some measure of project management automated just shows what an amazing time for artificial intelligence we're living in today. Thank you very much for your time.